Laura Vance was 24 years old, a woman whose hands were calloused from scrubbing floors, but whose eyes saw everything the rich tried to hide. She had moved from a small town in Georgia to the glimmering towers of Chicago, hoping for a better life. Today, she stood outside the heavy mahogany doors of the Sterling Global Boardroom. Inside, Barrett Sterling, a billionaire with a kind heart but a fading memory, was about to sign a document that would end his legacy. Sloane, his elegant secretary with lips as red as a warning sign, leaned over him with a predatory smile. Suddenly, Alara didn't think about her job or her rent. She kicked the doors open, her yellow cleaning gloves bright against the expensive decor. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice trembling but certain. She lunged across the table, grabbing the pen from Barrett's hand just as the tip touched the paper. The room went silent. Sloane's face twisted into a mask of pure rage, her eyes promising that Alara would never work in this city again. Before the chaos of the boardroom, Alara was just the girl in the shadows. She had spent months cleaning Barrett's office, noticing the small things others missed. She saw how Barrett always asked about her mother's health and how he left extra tips tucked under his coffee mug. He was a good man in a world of sharks. But Alara also noticed Sloane. She saw Sloane switching Barrett's vitamins with small, bitter-smelling white pills. She saw Sloane whispering into her phone about offshore accounts and liquidating assets once the old man was out of the way. Alara was a nobody, a girl from a family that had lost their pension to corporate greed years ago. She knew what it felt like to have everything stolen by a person in a suit. She couldn't let it happen to Barrett. She had spent the morning trembling, clutching a trash bag, waiting for the right moment to act, knowing that once she stepped into that light, there was no going back. Back in the boardroom, the tension was thick enough to choke on. "Get this girl out of here!" Sloane shrieked, her voice cracking like a whip. Security guards rushed toward Alara, grabbing her arms and dragging her toward the door. Barrett looked confused, his hands shaking as he wiped sweat from his forehead. "Alara? What is the meaning of this?" he asked, his voice sounding thin and frail. Sloane leaned in, her hand on his shoulder. "She's lost her mind, Barrett. Sign the merger. It's the only way to save your health." Barrett picked up a second pen, his eyes glazed over from the medication Sloane had been slipping him. Alara fought against the guards, kicking and screaming the truth. "The ink is poisoned, and the contract is a lie. Look at page 42. As the guards pinned her against the wall, Barrett paused. He turned to page 42, and his face went pale. Suddenly he gasped, clutching his chest as he fell forward onto the table. The room exploded into a panicked roar. In the flickering lights of the emergency room, the world slowed. Barrett was behind heavy doors, fighting for his life, while Alara sat on a hard plastic chair handcuffed to the armrest. The police had been called for her assault on the meeting. Sloane stood by the elevators, pretending to cry into a silk handkerchief, but Alara saw the way she checked her gold watch. Sloane was waiting for a phone call saying Barrett was gone. But Alara had been smart. Before the guards took her, she had snatched the bottle of vitamins from Sloane's desk and tucked them into her apron. As a young nurse walked by, Alara hissed her name. "Hish," she whispered. "Please, check these pills. They aren't medicine." The nurse hesitated, looking at the girl in the maid's uniform and then at the powerful woman by the elevator. She took the bottle and disappeared. Hours later, the nurse returned with a look of horror on her face, and Alara knew she had found the proof she needed to bring the empire down. The hospital alarms began to blare, as Barrett's heart rhythm faltered on the monitor. Doctors rushed past Alara, their faces grim, while Sloane stood in the corner, a calculated tear rolling down her cheek for the benefit of the security cameras. Alara watched in horror as a lawyer she didn't recognize arrived, handing Sloane a leather-bound folder. "The power of attorney is active," he whispered. Sloane's fake grief vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, sharp smile. She walked over to Alara, leaning down so only the maid could hear her. "You tried to be a hero, but now you're just a criminal. By morning, Barrett will be dead, and this company will be mine. You'll be rotting in a cell, and no one will ever believe a girl who scrubs toilets." Sloane signaled the police to take Alara away. As the handcuffs tightened, Alara saw Barrett's body go limp through the glass door, the flatline sound echoing through the sterile hallway. Days passed in a blur of gray walls and cold meals for Alara. She sat in her cell, praying for a miracle, until a visitor she didn't expect appeared at the glass. It was the young nurse from the hospital, her hands trembling as she held a file. "The pills were a slow-acting neurotoxin," she whispered through the intercom. "And Barrett, he isn't dead. I switched the records. Sloan thinks he's in the morgue, but we moved him to a private wing under a fake name." Ilara felt a surge of hope that nearly knocked her off her feet. The nurse had risked everything because Ilara had been the only one brave enough to speak up. With the help of a sympathetic public defender who hated corporate greed, Ilara was released on a technicality. She went straight to the hospital, finding Barrett awake but weak. He reached out and squeezed her hand, his eyes filling with tears of gratitude. The peace of the hospital room was shattered when the door kicked open. Sloan walked in, her heels clicking like gunshots on the tile. She wasn't alone. She had two men in dark suits with her. "I knew that death felt too easy," Sloan hissed, looking at Barrett with pure disgust. "You always were a stubborn old man." She pulled a new set of papers from her bag, a total transfer of assets. "Sign these or your little maid friend won't make it out of this building." One of the men grabbed Ilara by the hair, forcing her to her knees. Barrett tried to sit up, his face reddening with effort and anger. "You'll never get away with this, Sloan," he wheezed. Sloan just laughed, placing the pen in his shaking hand. "Who's going to stop me? The police I pay, or the board of directors who already think you're a vegetable?" She pressed the pen against his fingers, her eyes wild with greed. Just as Sloan began to force Barrett's hand across the paper, the fire alarm pulled. The overhead sprinklers doused the room in a freezing deluge, creating instant chaos. In the confusion, Ilara bit the hand of the man holding her and dove under the bed. She grabbed a heavy metal tray and swung it with all her might, catching Sloan's henchman in the knee. "Run, Barrett!" she screamed, helping the billionaire out of the bed and into a wheelchair. They burst into the hallway, soaked and shivering, as Sloan's screams of fury followed them. They didn't go for the elevator. Ilara knew that's where they'd be caught. Instead, she pushed him into the service freight lift, the same one she used to haul trash. As the doors closed, Ilara saw Sloan rounding the corner, her expensive dress ruined and her face a mask of demonic rage. They were out of the room, but they were still trapped in a building owned by the woman trying to kill them. The freight elevator lurched downward, but halfway between floors it groaned and came to a dead stop. Sloan had used her master key to kill the power. Ilara looked at Barrett, whose face was ghostly pale as he struggled to breathe in the cramped, dark space. Just as panic began to set in, Ilara's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "I know where you are. I can help. For a price." It was Julian, Barrett's longtime security chief, who had been fired by Sloan weeks earlier. He'd been watching from the shadows, bitter and hungry for revenge. $10 million, the text read, "and I'll open the doors and get you to my car. Refuse, and I tell Sloan which floor you're stuck on." Barrett looked at the screen and nodded weakly. He was being betrayed again, this time by a man he once trusted like a son, forced to buy his life from a mercenary. They spent the next 3 hours hiding in Julian's basement, a cold, concrete room on the edge of the city. While Julian paced upstairs, counting his promised money, Ilara worked tirelessly to keep Barrett's fever down. She used cold water and rags, whispering stories of her home in Georgia to keep him conscious. "Why are you doing this, Ilara?" he whispered, his eyes finally clearing. "You owe me nothing." Ilara smiled sadly, remembering her own father, who had died broken-hearted after his company stole his retirement. "In my world, Mr. Sterling, we don't leave people behind just because they're no longer useful. Kindness isn't a business deal." In that basement, the billionaire and the maid found a bond stronger than any contract. Barrett realized that all his wealth couldn't buy the loyalty Ilara gave for free, and he vowed that if he survived, he would spend the rest of his life being the man she believed him to be. The quiet moment was shattered when the basement door was kicked off its hinges. Julian hadn't just taken the money, he had double-crossed them. Behind him stood Sloan, holding a silenced pistol, her eyes burning with a manic light. "Double the payday, Julian. Good choice," she purred, tossing a heavy bag of cash at his feet. She stepped toward the bed where Barrett lay, leveling the gun at his head. I'm tired of this game, Barrett. The board has already voted me in as CEO. You're just a loose end now. She shifted her gaze to Alara, a cruel sneer on her red lips. And you, I think I'll let the police find you with the gun. The maid who killed the billionaire out of greed. It's a headline that writes itself. Sloane pulled back the hammer of the gun, her finger tightening on the trigger as Alara threw herself over Barrett's body to shield him. The gunshot echoed through the small room, but it wasn't Sloane who had fired. The basement windows shattered as a SWAT team swarmed in, their red laser sights dancing across Sloane's chest. In the doorway, the young nurse stood next to a high-ranking detective, holding up a digital recorder. Alara had never stopped her phone's recording app. Every word of Sloane's confession had been broadcasted directly to the police station. Sloane dropped the gun, her face draining of color as the handcuffs clicked around her delicate wrists. As she was dragged away, screaming that she was the CEO, Barrett stood up, leaning on Alara for support. He looked at Julian, who was being pinned to the floor, and then at Sloane. "You forgot one thing, Sloane," Barrett said, his voice returning to its former strength. "The people you look down on are the ones who actually keep the world turning."